Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. This week on the show, Giorgia Meloni's attempt to overhaul the Italian judiciary has failed. Now the race is on to save a key plank of Britain's legal system, trial by jury.
It is because I have endured every indignity that our broken criminal justice system could mete out that I care what kind of reform will actually deliver justice for survivors and victims of crime.
Then, national elections in Denmark and municipal elections in France bring wins for the centre-left, but with some pretty significant caveats. We'll be exploring both stories here on Inside Europe. Something very significant happened this week in Italy. Giorgia Meloni, a leader who, up until now, had seemed politically unassailable, lost a referendum. Not just any referendum, a referendum on judicial reforms seen as key to the long-term goals of Meloni and her ruling Fratelli d'Italia party, which has its roots in the post-World War II neo-fascist Italian social movement. The result, when it came, was clear, giving around 54% to the No campaign and 46% to the Yes vote. The question on the ballot was complicated and technical, but at stake, many analysts warned, was the independence of the Italian judiciary itself. From Rome, Megan Williams reports.
Early morning swim practice at a sports club in Rome for members of Italy's Court of Auditors. Then, over cappuccino, a heated debate about the judicial reform referendum that has now been rejected by voters. At its core, the proposal would have ended a system that allows judges and state prosecutors to switch roles during their careers and split Italy's powerful self-governing Judiciary Council in two, with some members chosen by lottery instead of being elected by their peers. Lawyer Marta Morelli swam against the tide here, voting yes. She argues the reform would simply have brought Italy more in line with the rest of Europe. But the majority of Italians, almost 54%, voted against it, including magistrate Maria Francesca Abonevoli, who warned the changes would have struck at the heart of Italy's post-war constitution, written to ensure fascism and Nazism would never return, by protecting the independence of the judiciary. In the end, many voters didn't engage deeply with the legal details. They gathered in piazzas and voted based on how they feel about Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, and the direction of her government. Her close alignment with leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban and U.S. President Donald Trump has raised concerns among critics about the erosion of democratic checks and balances. At home, her government has also pushed through tougher security measures, expanding powers for precautionary arrest, and even criminalizing certain forms of protest, like blocking roads. For some voters, these moves fed into broader fears about the concentration of power.
These governments of other countries have been pursuing some agenda of limiting the checks and balances and trying to weaken the counter powers that we have in democracy. Some have interpreted this as going in the same direction, which is, that is to say, we don't want Italy to start possibly going down that path.
Political scientist Lorenzo Di Sio says the result weakens Meloni's right-wing coalition.
It's a problem for the government because they cannot claim important reforms.
And it may complicate her broader political agenda.
If this reform was successful, they had plans for more reforms, and electoral reforms, possibly even another institutional reform. Now that these plans are not viable, not feasible, then the question comes, what projects do we have for the next year in the term? And this might be such a severe problem that one of the scenarios that they might call early elections, precisely for not having to walk through this limbo for 1 year.
Still, Meloni is not going anywhere.
La sovranità appartiene al popolo
In her concession speech, videotaped in her backyard, she said her government will continue to work with determination, ruling out resigning, a decision which, for now, voters largely support.
She was very smart in not personalizing this referendum,
says political research at the Italian Center for Electoral Study, Elisabetta Meloni.
because Italy has a massive issue with government instability. Since the beginning of the Republic, we never, ever had a single government who managed to finish the term.
If Meloni manages to stay in office until late 2027, she would be the first Italian prime minister to complete a full term since the end of the Second World War. And researcher Meloni says she's likely to apply the same strategy to future reforms, including plans to change how prime ministers are elected, presenting her proposals as improvements for the country with advantages she personally doesn't need.
I don't even need it. As you see, I'm very stable. People don't want me to resign. I don't need this, but I do it because I know that Italy has a problem with this. So I'm doing this for Italy.
But even without immediate political consequences, the referendum result has punctured something important: Meloni's image as a political winner. After 3.5 years in power, she'd built a reputation for momentum. That is now stalled. Timing didn't help. Rising living costs, global tensions, and concerns about energy prices with the war on Iran have all been weighing on voters. Her defeat also now offers an opening for Italy's center-left opposition to do what they've failed to do in recent years: overcome internal fights and pull together a broad alliance capable of taking on Italy's right in the next elections. Megan Williams, DW, Rome.
Proposals for reforms to the legal system are a matter of hot debate in the UK too at the moment, with the government determined to press ahead with plans to scrap jury trials for thousands of criminal cases in England and Wales. Under the plans, offences likely to attract sentences of 3 years or less would be heard by a judge sitting alone. Ministers say the change will help tackle the huge backlog of 80,000 cases in the Crown Court. But, as Nick Martin reports, the proposals have triggered strong opposition, with lawyers and judges warning against the erosion of a right long seen as a cornerstone of the British justice system.
Stand, please.
The justice system in England and Wales is at breaking point.
If you're a barrister practising in the Crown Court, over the last few years, you've got used to nothing working. There's no expectation anymore that a case will start on time.
Kirsty Brimelow, KC, chair of the Bar Council of England and Wales, sums up the deep frustration felt right across the court system because of a huge backlog of cases. Today, nearly 80,000 cases are waiting in the Crown Court, more than double the number before the pandemic.
This is the first case on your list, FC 267-34598, and is the matter of Wessex County Council and Local.
The government, led by Justice Secretary David Lammy, insists the reforms will free up thousands of hearing days for the most serious cases, such as murder and rape, while still preserving jury trials where longer sentences are likely. Ministers argue that without change, the backlog could reach 200,000 by 2035. Critics, however, say independent analysis shows that moving to judge-only trials would deliver only marginal time savings. They insist that real solutions lie in funding, recruiting more judges and barristers, reopening closed courts, and fixing failing technology. Brimelow warns that removing judges could damage public trust, especially in cases involving minority groups.
Jury trials are effectively the only part of the criminal justice system where any prejudices are balanced out, whereas other parts of the criminal justice system have been shown to be damaged by prejudices, and particularly towards minority groups. And so if you take away a jury and a defendant is convicted by a single judge, there might be a lack of trust in that conviction.
Your Worship, at this point I'd like to make an application for Mr Hudson to remain in court throughout the duration of the proceedings.
For victims, the court delays can be agonising. Rape survivors often wait more than 400 days, sometimes well over 18 months for a trial to begin. Many describe the pain of being unable to move on with their lives or simply choose to withdraw from the process altogether. Defendants also suffer. Those on bail can wait years before their names are cleared or their guilt confirmed. Those held in custody on remand can spend months, sometimes longer, in prison awaiting trial, only for charges to be dropped or reduced later. Such is the strong feeling in the legal profession that solicitors, barristers, kings, counsel, retired judges and a former director of public prosecutions have signed the Bar Council's open letter urging the Prime Minister to abandon the plan. The letter states, "We do not support the erosion of a deeply entrenched constitutional principle for negligible gain and with substantial risks."
It's signed by over 3,200 legal professionals, and it's unprecedented to have that level of solidarity across the legal profession. The letter includes not only barristers, but it also includes retired judges, really very strongly coming out in favour of retaining the jury system. So we're saying to the government and to the Prime Minister, listen to those people who work within the courts. We know how we can get the delays down if you will give us the tools to do so.
The proposals were the subject of a heated debate in Parliament earlier this month, with MPs from all sides clashing over the right balance between clearing the courts and protecting long-standing legal rights. Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips, herself a victim of the court's backlog, gave the reforms her full support. She revealed that a man accused of breaching a restraining order against her will not face trial until 2028 and said the court system is too often used by perpetrators to control victims. But even within her ruling Labour Party, there is unease. Charlotte Nichols, MP for Warrington North, has waived her right to anonymity after being raped at a work event. She told Parliament that the government's framing of the debate has troubled her.
We have been told that if we have concerns about this bill, it is because we have not been raped or because we don't care enough for rape victims. The opposite is true in my case. It is because I have been raped that I'm as passionate as I am about what it means for a justice system to be truly victim-focused. It is because I have endured every indignity that our broken criminal justice system could mete out that I care what kind of reform will actually deliver justice for survivors and victims of crime.
Although the government insists the plans are strictly limited to lower-level crimes likely to attract sentences of 3 years or less, legal experts fear mission creep. They warn that once the principle of trial by jury is removed even for these cases, it could gradually be extended to more serious offences in the future. One of the most powerful critics of the change is former Conservative Attorney General Sir Geoffrey Cox, KC.
It must be a non-ideological space, the administration of justice. And jury trial unites us all for a simple reason. It is the most powerful instrument and engine of social justice that this country has ever invented. It is a safeguard against oppression. It is a built-in defence against establishment and administrative power.
The Courts and Tribunals Bill has cleared its second reading in the House of Commons despite some Labour rebellions. Whether it survives further scrutiny may depend on whether ministers can convince Parliament and the public that faster justice justifies limiting a right long regarded as a cornerstone of the British legal system. Nick Martin, DW.
A trial by 12 of one's peers. Is there anything quite like it, mon ami? I feel that the fictional Hercule Poirot might be asking right now. Time to move on to elections. It's been a big week for election results in Europe. We're going to focus in on Denmark and France. To Denmark first, which saw snap elections on Tuesday, called by Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who was gambling that the so-called Greenland bounce, in the wake of her stand against Donald Trump's hostile takeover overtures, would serve her Social Democrats well. So, did the gamble pay off? That's the question that I put to Adrian Marie Nielsen in Copenhagen.
She did call the snap election because of Greenland, because of that uptick in the polls, and she hoped it would be enough to carry her through to victory. But it doesn't appear to be the result that she was hoping for. Now, Denmark Social Democrats, her party, they won the most votes. So they took 22% of the vote. So they came first, but it's not enough to claim victory alone. And actually, it was the weakest showing for her party in more than a century. So she's now in this difficult situation where she doesn't have enough for a majority. So she's having to negotiate now to see if she can find some kind of support from lots of smaller parties to have enough to get over that 90-seat majority to be able to form a government. The Red Bloc, the left-wing parties that back Frederiksen and her party, they did come first. They claimed a total of 84 seats and they beat the Blue Bloc, her opposition, so that's the right-wing parties. And we have this very strange situation now where there's one party in the centre, a small party called the Moderates, which is led by another former Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen. So they're sat in this interesting position as a kind of kingmaker in the centre that can wield a lot of power and help steer what shape the next government might take.
Ah, interesting. So all eyes on the kingmaker. What can you tell me about him?
He's a former Prime Minister and he actually used to lead the Liberals. So he used to be on the right. He came back as a former Prime Minister, launched a new party a few years ago called the Moderates. And because they sit in this centrist position, they have a lot of power to be able to go either way for either side to get over that 90-seat threshold. So he's also this interesting figure because he was in government with Mette Frederiksen last time, and he, as foreign minister, took a very significant lead role in all the negotiations over Greenland. So he's been very influential, and he is actually quite well liked.
For a long time, Denmark has been looked to as a European outlier, an example of a country led by a social democratic party which has managed to hold the far right at bay by adopting very, very harsh policies on immigration, asylum policy, and so on. Can this election tell us anything about whether that approach is still working?
That's a really good question because certainly in the last two elections, that helped her win back a lot of left-wing, working-class voters that cared about immigration deeply. And immigration has featured as a very big issue for many years in Denmark. And that's worked for her as this recipe, sort of left-wing welfare-based policies, but then hard right on migration. Other countries in Europe, particularly the UK, are looking at Denmark as this sort of magic formula to keep centre-left parties in power. But it seems to be unravelling a little bit this time because she's certainly, by going more centrist and hard right on those policies, she has alienated some of her left-wing voters. One thing I heard time and time again when I was speaking to voters in the last couple of weeks, certainly here in Copenhagen in the capital, was that people did not like those policies. They thought they were unnecessarily hostile. So on the left, there are voters that have punished her for that and they don't like her handling of migration. But at the same time, Danske Folkeparti, they're this far-right party, the Danish People's Party. They have tripled their seats this time. They were obliterated in the last two elections pretty much, but they've had this big bounce back. And their leader, Morten Messerschmidt, he got the most personal votes this time in the whole election, in the whole country. So I think that's quite telling that this migration issue is still something that's capturing the imagination of some voters, and they want to see it go even further.
Adrian Murray-Nielsen talking to me from Copenhagen there. Paris is next. That's here on Inside Europe. France now, where our Paris correspondent John Lawrenson has been preparing his post-vote analysis of the municipal elections, widely seen as a bellwether for the all-crucial presidential elections coming up next year. Without giving too much away, I can tell you that it is very much a tale of town and country.
It was the image of election night, the victorious socialist candidate Emmanuel Grégoire riding to Paris City Hall on a Vélib city bicycle. Grégoire romped home to an unexpectedly easy win over his centre-right rival after refusing to ally with the populist left France Unbowed candidate for the second round of the polls. It was the same story in France's second city, Marseille, where a socialist who refused an alliance with France Unbowed beat off a strong challenge from Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally. In fact, the socialists won in most of the big cities. However, as Olivier Truchot, co-presenter of the popular talk show Les Grandes Gueules, or The Big Mouths, remarked, there are two Frances.
There's
the France of the big cities, Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Rennes, Nantes, Montpellier, Strasbourg and Lille, which are all left-wing. But in the medium-sized towns and in the country, people vote for the right by a large majority, or for National Rally, which managed to win a number of these smaller cities and towns in these polls, Truchot explained. There's even a third France, he added, the France of the poor city suburbs, which have large immigrant origin populations and which vote for France Unbowed. That party won a number of towns in the suburbs of Paris and Lyon in particular. In Paris, where only 1 in 4 people own a car, people talk about bicycles. In the country, they're worried about the price of petrol. Finding candidates who can talk to these different populations will be crucial in next year's presidential and parliamentary elections. But what other lessons can politicians take away from the municipals? Well, one key takeaway is the question of alliances.
Ils ont tranché pour la clarté.
France has chosen clarity. This is Raphael Glucksmann, considered a likely centre-left candidate in next year's presidential elections, saying that the French voters have responded to clear positioning.
Pour la clarté, lorsque la droite refuse l'alliance avec l'extrême droite.
When the right refuses to ally itself with the far right and when the left respects the principles of the French Republic, they win. Glucksmann is referring to the fact that alliances with the hard-left France Unbowed party failed to win in the historically left-wing cities of Toulouse, Limoges and Brest. This follows mounting controversy surrounding its leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has been accused of anti-Semitism and encouraging violence on the streets following the killing of far-right activist Quentin Deronque earlier in the year. Meanwhile, Glucksmann pointed out,
La gauche républicaine qui refuse l'alliance avec LFI, elle gagne.
The left that refuses to ally itself with France Unbowed is a winning force. It won Paris, Marseille, Lille, Montpellier, Rennes and Saint-Étienne, and that is an immense lesson for the future.
Pour l'avenir.
The Republican Party, for its part, stood by its traditional policy of maintaining a cordon sanitaire against the far right. Although Éric Ciotti, the ex-leader of the centre-right Republicans who quit the party to ally himself with Marine Le Pen's National Rally, won Nice, France's 5th biggest city. On the left, the leader of the Socialist Party, Olivier Faure, now says France Unbowed is a ball and chain for the rest of the left. A year from now, the French will vote for a new president. It's very difficult to see, following these latest polls, how any candidate can bring together the two sides of the left, let alone reach across the deepening divide between city and small-town France. John Lawrenson, DW, Paris.
Interesting times ahead. We will be following it all here on Inside Europe. That's with me, Kate Laycock, in Germany. Welcome back to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. This half hour, we're going to be exploring questions of freedom and unfreedom, of who gets to belong and who is considered expendable or exploitable. Questions which shape our present and inform our understanding of our past, as I found out when I spoke to Miqueias Muga, a historian of Brazil and Germany at Princeton University, and his colleague Victoria Bergbauer, a cultural and social historian of modern Europe and its global entanglements. The story that they shared with me was one of mutiny on the high seas, so I couldn't resist. It was a dark and stormy night. The year was 1824, and the good ship Germania was battling its way across the Atlantic, fighting a tempestuous sea.
When the ship was crossing the Atlantic off the coast of West Africa, 8 men decided to take control of the ship. They have been talking about this possibility of taking control of the ship for quite a while, since the ship was still stationed in the Hamburg port. Once they got together, they leveraged the opportunity of a storm to try to kill the crew of the ship, the captain, and then reroute the ship to another European port. They were thinking here about Spain or Portugal.
So who were these 8 men? And why were they on board a ship heading from the German port city of Hamburg to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil?
This ship was carrying immigrants. From the German territories. Germany was not a unified country at that time, and sailing to Brazil with some 400 people. These people would there become settlers. They will work the land, farm the land, or specifically men would be recruited into the Brazilian military.
It wasn't just a ship, it wasn't just an easy way of migrating people out of German territories. What we see here is a very intricate camouflage operation almost. So next to families, free families, you have people recruited from the prison, people from the prison who have been incarcerated for years.
In a practice with eerie echoes of the modern-day era in which the Russian mercenary organisation Wagner spearheaded a drive to recruit frontline soldiers directly from prison, the men were offered freedom, but only on the condition that they board the Germania and set sail for Brazil, where they would either settle the land or help to defend it.
Here's the offer. You can choose to sign it. You will bind yourself for 10 years within Brazil. You can then also leave again. And what we promise you is that you can farm your own land and you have a freedom that you're not experiencing right now within a prison.
But the men don't want conditional freedom far from home. They want absolute freedom. And, under the cover of the storm, they set out to take it.
I mean, the remarkable thing about this is, they leave the prison, and as they're leaving the prison to get onto the ship, they leave their shackles. They're told, now you're entering into freedom as you're crossing the Atlantic into your new destination, which, I mean, that's also something we have to think about. These people left their homes. They had no idea what to expect, but that they came together and decided, I'm going to take my freedom in my own hands. I'm not trusting this. And I'm going to take charge of my ship, of my own future, quite literally.
Despite wide support amongst the other passengers, the mutiny fails. The men are executed, right there on the ship.
I mean, this is not according to a judicial code. This is not according to a set of rules. This is complete improvisation as the ship is going and approaching Brazil.
Was it a mutiny? Was it a revolt? Was it a revolution? So in the sources, we find these 3 different characterizations. And if it was a revolution, then definitely capital punishment was the way to deal with it. And here we see a little bit more about what freedom did not mean as well.
Let's just pause here, because this is significant. How could the actions of 8 men aboard one ship constitute a revolution?
It's because these people didn't just comply to the rules on the ship, they also didn't comply to the idea and the logic of the project. And they went against that freedom that was meant to be carved out for them and tried to find another way of that. And I think that's also why it was such a severe punishment that followed, because from the Brazilian side as well, and from the architects of this project, who will be represented by the crew on the ship, this is about the legitimacy of the project in itself.
The legitimacy of the settler colonial project in Brazil, but also of the social order back in Europe, in which industrialisation, enclosures, unemployment and vagrancy laws were combining to create surplus labour and surplus people.
So the question of who deserves to belong to a nation, to an empire, to a territory, to a city, to a town, I think that's very much present in the discussions today, and it was present back then, 200 years ago, when Hamburg was deciding who the city could get rid of, and Brazil was deciding who they wanted to accept as new citizens of the country.
Why does it matter to look at this mutiny that happened on a stormy night at the beginning of the 19th century? Why should we look at that? It matters because I think it is a good reminder of how we might be comfortable in thinking about freedom versus slavery, freedom versus incarceration.
And what of the Germania's surviving passengers? What traces might we find of them today?
The 8 men obviously did not make it, but the descendants of the other passengers, they settled in southern Brazil, and there are many books of genealogies of these families. Some of them still speak German today as sort of a very specific Brazilian dialect of German. But if you travel to southern Brazil and then you arrive in Porto Alegre, this town, this city, take a car and drive an hour and 30 minutes from there to the north, you'll definitely find descendants of the Germania passengers, and they might speak to you in German.
One aspect of the Germania and of these stories that we see is how hard it is to trace them. And I think there's something to be said about, yes, southern Brazil speaks German, but at the same time, many people probably also don't know that their family members from generations before left a space of imprisonment and arrived in Brazil because of that negotiation, because it's also a page in history that people didn't want to think about and didn't want to own once they arrived. There's always some sort of silence that marks this legacy and this story as well.
Historians Victoria Bergbauer and Mikaeus Muger there. My thanks to them for that incredible story straight from the Hamburg City Archives. A story which echoes down to us in the present.
All 20 of us sleep in this cramped room, bodies side by side. We are chronically sleep-deprived from long shifts and brutal living conditions. The sleeping containers are infested with cockroaches and bedbugs. I can't even remember the last time I properly showered.
Those are the words of a man who doesn't actually exist, or at least not as such. Gimyuk is a fictional character whose story is featured in a new report out this week entitled A Day in the Life of a DPRK, that's Democratic People's Republic of Korea, state-sponsored labourer in St. Petersburg, Russia. The report from the International Law Foundation Global Rights Compliance is based on an amalgamation of 21 testimonies from DPRK nationals who have worked on or are currently working on construction sites across 3 Russian cities. The testimonies were collected with the help of a local partner who cannot be identified, but who was himself a victim of enforced labour. Inside Europe's newest team member, Emma Meyer, spoke to Global Rights Compliance's North Korea advisor, Yeji Kim.
Kim-hyuk could really tell his story and all of the North Korean labor story really well because his story is really representative. So he's 29 years old from Pyongyang, and he has a wife and a young daughter. But he really bribed for this opportunity because he wanted to get a chance to work in Russia with the dream of saving up to provide a better future for his daughter.
Gimyok considers himself lucky, actually, to have been selected for this program. He doesn't know, for example, that the fact that he has a family will be used against him as a way to manipulate him, for example. And he actually has no idea of the scale of the scheme he's about to enter.
So we understand this DPRK Overseas Working Program as a classic example of quid pro quo between North Korea and Russia. Russia, ever since it started its aggression war between Ukraine and Russia, they are chronically suffering from manpower shortage, and the construction site hit hardest. On the other hand, what North Korea needs is Russia's military intelligence, military support.
We move to the worksite together, always as a group. Guards control the perimeter. The city may be just beyond the fence, but we are sealed off from it. A few times a year, we are allowed out, but only in groups, heads counted, with a fixed time to return. I am always on my guard. Here, you can never fully trust anyone, because it is a known secret that every worksite has at least one informer.
When the Koreans arrive, their passports are taken away from them, and they have no possibility to leave, and they are under constant surveillance. So they are physically and psychologically trapped.
Every afternoon, I find myself calculating whether I can meet this month's quota. I came out not knowing how much I would receive. I just thought that if I went to Russia, I'd earn money. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a state quota. If the quota is not met, the shortfall carries forward. After deductions, there is often nothing left.
Yeji Kim says that the state quota is used as a form of control. Almost all of the workers' wages end up going to fill this quota. After accommodation and food, there's nothing left for them, and they even find themselves in debt.
Vast majority of interviewees that we spoke to directly told us that they had some idea of, okay, we probably need to pay some sort of quota to the states, but they had no idea how much that would be and how unrealistic sometimes the quotas are. So that's a classic example of deception.
So North Korean workers are on site for up to 16 hours a day, no days off, regardless of weather conditions or physical injuries. And falling short is not an option because their families back home could face reprisals.
It is blizzarding now, and my entire body feels like a wet towel. My hands are cracked and swollen from the cold. They freeze so badly that gripping tools becomes agony. If someone slows down, the rest of us pay. Longer hours, fewer breaks, punishment that teaches the group to police itself.
The report estimates that around 100,000 workers are trapped in the forced labor program, which operates in 40 countries and generates some $500 million annually for North Korea. And of those workers, something like 40,000 are believed to be in Russia.
Russia is clearly aware about that, and none of these programs is possible without close cooperation between Russia and North Korea.
The workers need immediate relief. They need shorter working hours, they need better equipment, and there are many ways to assist them.
Our ultimate goal is to abolish state-sponsored forced labor. In order to achieve that goal, I think international community should really start with monitoring, because we can't solve what we cannot see and what we don't understand.
In the meantime, there are tens of thousands of people like Kim-yuk who will continue to suffer.
The evenings are the hardest. My body is so exhausted that when the day finally winds down, the loneliness hits all at once. I think of my wife and my daughter. Sometimes months pass without my family knowing where I am.
Neil King voicing the fictional testimony of Kim Myuk there. Emma Meyer spoke to Yeji Kim of Global Rights Compliance for that story. We will link to their report in the show notes. North Korea's forced labour programme is a case apart, but there are significant numbers of migrant workers from other countries working voluntarily in Russia at the moment. Millions, in fact, with Central Asian migrants making up the biggest grouping. Levi Bridges sent us this report from Kyrgyzstan, where he has been listening to the stories of those that have returned.
When the Russian economy started taking off in the early 2000s, millions of migrant workers from Central Asia moved to Russia to find better-paying jobs. But since Russia invaded Ukraine 4 years ago, many have decided to return home, finding work in places like this construction site outside my apartment in Kyrgyzstan. It's estimated that more than 500,000 Central Asians have left Russia in recent years. In the neighborhood where I live in Kyrgyzstan, I keep running into people who just returned from cities like Moscow. Here at my local coffee shop, most of the baristas recently moved to Kyrgyzstan from Moscow. The barista making my cappuccino tells me he was born here in Kyrgyzstan but grew up in Russia. Like everyone in the story, he didn't want to give his name because he fears retaliation from Russian authorities for speaking with a Western journalist about the treatment of migrants.
I do like Central Asia, but there's just a lot more opportunity for young people in Moscow compared to here. I would have preferred to stay, but it was just getting very uncomfortable living there. The police are always stopping foreigners to check their documents.
These kinds of document checks have always been a problem in Russia, but migrants say the practice has gotten a lot worse since Russia invaded Ukraine. The war has made life far more unstable in Russia. To distract attention, Russian politicians accuse migrant workers of causing crime and other social problems. The Russian government has even passed legislation that forbids migrants in many parts of the country from working low-skilled jobs, like driving taxis. They've also stopped Russian schools from accepting young children who don't speak the Russian language well. And they use digital technology to track migrants with facial recognition. Recently, I talked on the phone with a man from Tajikistan who spent most of his life in St. Petersburg. He says back 15 years ago, the ruble was strong. You could earn a lot of money, and people never looked at you just because of your skin color.
The immigration restrictions first started tightening a decade ago, after Russia invaded Crimea. And in the years since, life has become so hard for minorities in Russia that now I plan to return to Tajikistan as soon as I can save enough money. But to be honest, I don't want to leave Russia. Imagine how it feels to spend years working in a country, learning the language, making friends, then you have to throw it all away and move.
But for people like him, staying in Russia is increasingly risky. News reports show Russian authorities launching immigration raids and harshly interrogating young men from Central Asia. Malika Bahovadinova is a political anthropologist at the University of Amsterdam who studies migration in Russia. She says after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, far-right politicians started having greater sway in Russia's politics, allowing them to push forward a more xenophobic agenda. But the repression served a dual purpose, she says, because the authorities sent many of the migrants they arrested to fight for Russia in Ukraine.
Migrant workers were basically either pushed to fight or, if you don't want, please leave.
I talked to one man from Uzbekistan who was arrested by police in Russia and taken to a detention center. He says the authorities immediately made him an offer.
The officers said to me, "Do you want an easy way to earn good money and feed your family? We can make you a Russian citizen if you go to the front in Ukraine and forget about all of this."
Instead, he chose deportation back to his home country, along with hundreds of thousands of others who have voluntarily left or were deported from Russia in recent years. Despite the deteriorating human rights situation for migrants in Russia, many tell me they didn't want to leave.
I love Moscow. I learned so much there, and I get along well with the Russians. But it's impossible to live there now as a foreigner.
Many of these returnees are finding ways to work in Europe. Central Asians now make up a large number of seasonal workers who come to Britain each year as guest workers. Giulio Benedetti is a doctoral student in sociology, focusing on Central Asia at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. He says trucking companies throughout Europe lost many of their Ukrainian drivers after the war started. So now they're also hiring Central Asians as drivers.
There is anecdotal evidence that Ukrainians were less available because of the war. So companies started recruiting in Russian-speaking former Soviet Union countries.
But for those who can't find work in Europe, moving back to the countries where they were born is often their only option. Back in my local coffee shop in Kyrgyzstan, the barista who recently returned from Russia says he wants to move abroad again, and soon. I really want to somehow get to Europe too, he says. He just doesn't want to end up there by joining Russia's war in Ukraine. Levi Bridges, DW, Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan.
Freedom, unfreedom, and the conditions which prescribe our choices. Those are our themes here on Inside Europe. When I was putting this cluster of stories together, I was reminded of a piece that I'd heard on GBH's The World. The reporter was Jerry Haddon, and the story was about the plight of foreign workers from Romania to Turkey, lured to Spain by the promise of high wages working on FC Barcelona's multi-million-dollar stadium makeover. With permission, here's that report for you now.
Outside Barca's new stadium, a whistle blows. Actually, it's a lot of whistles. Blowing them are about 24 Turkish steelworkers. They're trying to get the attention of Barca's president, Joan Laporta, who's just shown up for a board meeting. Laporta, they chant, you jerk, try some manual labor. In Spanish, it rhymes. But either Laporta's wearing earbuds set to noise cancellation, or he just doesn't want to turn his head as he walks inside.
Burada Barça Stadyumu'nun inşaatını tamamladık. Çelik kondüksiyon işi yapıyoruz.
We built this stadium, one worker tells me, putting up all this steel for 21 months. The construction company has fired us for complaining about conditions and pay, he says. They owe us back pay and severance, he says, but we'll stay out here day and night until we get our money. Something's fishy, he says. The company isn't paying our wages or payroll taxes. That company is called Limak. It's Turkish. This project is Limak's first ever in Europe. It won the contract because its bid was the lowest, says reporter Elisenda Colei with the Barcelona newspaper El Periódico. She and her team found out perhaps why after investigating labor practices on the stadium remodel.
Nos encontramos en unas condiciones muy abusivas y muy irregulares.
We found abusive and irregular conditions, she says. Workers putting in extra hours without getting paid, men working without contracts, working weekends and not getting paid for that. The company took advantage of them, she says, because the workers either didn't know their rights or were too scared to speak up. The controversy began in 2023 when Limak hired a Hungarian firm to fly in hundreds of Romanian laborers. Each dawn, the men were bused to the site, worked 10-hour days, and were bused home. At their low-end hotel, they barely had time to eat something cold. They had no kitchen, then hit the hay.
A spus că ne dă 100 de euro pe zi, cazare asigurată, transport asigurat și 3 mese.
This Romanian worker wouldn't show his face in a documentary Colei's team made. We were promised 100 euros a day, he says, plus housing and meals. But the paychecks weren't arriving. The Romanians burned through their savings, then went on strike, like the Turks today. In retaliation, the company threatened to stop paying their hotel costs.
Esta gente se vio en esos hoteles sin poderlos pagar, en la calle y sin poder volver a sus casas.
Fearing being on the street, Colei says, most workers settled for one-way bus tickets home to Romania. She says only a few ever got fully paid. That's the fate these Turkish welders hope to avoid. One of Spain's largest labor unions, known as the Labor Commissions, is trying to help. Carlos del Barrio has been explaining to the men their rights here in Europe, and he bought them the whistles. He says there was a global uproar before the World Cup in Qatar in 2022 over exploited workers there, while here, he says, no one seems to care. It's easier to block out the moon with your thumb, he says, using a Spanish proverb to describe willfully ignoring reality. Abuses were more extreme on the stadium builds in the Middle East, he says, but this kind of exploitation must be denounced anywhere, including in democracies that are supposedly more advanced. Del Barrio says the union wrote to FC Barcelona demanding dialogue, but it never heard back. I reached out to and to the contractor, Limac, but neither has responded. The club may be ignoring the workers' complaints, but the regional government of Catalonia isn't. Workplace inspectors have fined Barça and its subcontractors around $7 million so far for labor violations, including overworking workers and not ensuring they have contracts and insurance. But nothing seems to change. Here again, reporter Elisenda Colei.
En realidad, el Camp Nou ocurre cada día y en cada barrio.
What's been happening at Camp Nou is a daily reality on virtually all major construction projects in Spain, she says. For example, the new high-speed train station in Barcelona or the metro expansion. It's a structural problem whereby the owner subcontracts out to companies whose only job is to find cheap labor. And those companies, she says, feed off the misery of migrants. In this case, she says, Barça is not legally responsible for the treatment of workers building its own stadium. But morally,
un club que dice ser más que un club.
Barca's motto is, quote, more than a club, and it claims to stand for certain values, she says. You'd think it'd keep a close eye on how its stadium construction workers are treated. You'd think they'd care. But if Barça doesn't, the Turkish workers say, maybe its fans will. They come from near and far to visit. There's the stadium, but also the stores, the cafes, and an immersive reality experience called Virtual Dream, where you put on high-tech goggles and become a player. During the protest, a local resident stops to watch and read the picket signs. When she learns that the workers are no longer getting their rent paid, she gets mad. Let them fight for their rights, she says. They have to do this because if they're not respected, they'll get nowhere. Workers agree they have no choice. As for getting somewhere, it could end up being just a ticket back to Turkey. But for now, they say they'll hold out for all the money they're owed.
Jerry Haddon's report was first aired on The World.
I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're with The World, Public Radio's leading global news program.
We cover the biggest news events developing every day and give you the context you need to make sense of them.
And Carolyn, I also like our smaller stories, tales of discovery and human kindness, things that make us laugh.
Stories that kind of shrink our world and make us feel more connected.
Subscribe and listen every weekday to The World.
We have reached the end of the programme and indeed our exploration of freedom and unfreedom throughout Europe and indeed throughout the centuries. This programme was produced by Laura Kabelka and me, Kate Laycock, with help from Emma Meyer. Our studio engineer was Gerd Georgi. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn.